some specifics about how to use those. We'll talk about those some more in just a couple minutes. So that's what that means by using the questions and the examples. The key points that we want to get across is, again, listening carefully, making sure you're hearing between the cracks, okay? Hear what isn't being said as well as what is being said. You know, they say a good sculptor can see the absence of something in order to see what is present. And so we got to really pay attention carefully. If there's any question about what you think you understand, it's your job as the assessor to verify, to validate, to say, I think I heard you say this. Am I right? Or did you mean something else? So those active listening techniques, that kind of stuff, for verification is absolutely critical. All right, so there's your scoring scale for importance. You can see that on the assessment itself. A 1 says, I don't care about this at all. I don't want it. I don't care about it. It doesn't matter to me. A 5 says, I don't, it's like sometimes, sort of, kind of, but it's not that big a deal, okay? And then a 10 says, my life goes to hell in a handbasket if I don't have this. I've got to have this in my life. If I only had one thing in my life, this would have to be there, okay? Now, you also have the reality that you've got a lot of people who are living in a state of what they consider to be emotional deprivation or situational deprivation, where they want a lot of things they can't get to. So what you have is a whole lot of people scoring importance as a 10 on a lot of stuff. Okay? But that's why you have to have the barriers part of this to help make it balance out. Okay? Because something can be absolutely critical in my life, like I absolutely have to have social contact. That's a 10. But if I don't perceive any barriers, it doesn't mean I have to actually do anything about it. Does that make sense? Okay? So we'll talk about that in the scoring a little bit more. All right, then you've got the scoring for the barriers, and we've talked about this just a little bit, where you've got the two ends of the spectrum of I can get this or avoid it if I want to. If I'm trying to avoid it, nobody's forcing me to do it, all the way to the other end where I can never get this. There's a total barrier, and even if I'm trying to avoid it, they make me do it. In the middle is that 5 score is that I really don't like, having to make my bed, but, they only make a big deal out of it about once a week, so I can deal with it. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So there's your visual cues of both importance and the barriers. Can I ask you to pass those out for me? And there's a bigger handout that goes along with it. Actually, my colleagues in Texas are the ones who helped to develop this, but then what they did was, because of the low levels of language that they have with many of the folks that they work with, they have a wide spectrum, but they have a big chunk of folks who have very poor language skills. They actually created a flip book of pictures for each one of these items. And we were actually talking about creating a similar book and marketing it and all that other kind of stuff, but that kind of gets in the way of my belief that I'm supposed to give this stuff away. And when I started thinking about how much it was going to cost to make that book, I said, I can't afford to give that away. So, to make a long story short, you can find what a picture of romance looks like. You can find pictures of what social contact looks like. And, do you want this or not? You can start that, do you want this a whole lot or just a little bit? And so that, the visual cueing, and even though these didn't print in color, you guys could easily do it in color, but their stuff is vibrantly colored. You know what I mean? And it's really very, very attractive, and folks engage in it quite well. All right, so any questions? All right, then we'll move on. This would be an example of one of those times when you can see that the point being is that sometimes we're supporting things that shouldn't be supported. Sometimes we're propping up things, and we've actually created a dangerous situation in making something, quote, safe. Okay? Yeah, they've got housing. Yeah, they've got food. Yeah, they're freaking living on the edge of a disaster. Like these guys. Okay? So let's talk about this for just a minute. These are the questions of who am I? And the reason I use the who am I, I'm going to let you do the passing out this time if you would, if you don't mind. Who am I, the language, is actually the title of the Stephen Reese book, the original book that he created when he was explaining this, and which has all the things on the set points and the variances, and if you go to page 7 at the bottom, it gives you the specific reference. Thank you very much. It's who am I, the 16 basic desires that motivate our actions and define our personalities. And like I said, he's now modified that and it's squished down and done some other things with it, so we're down to 15. It was 15 for people who had disabilities and 16 for people who didn't, and then he went back and squished, and so now it's the same. All right, so let's just use the help others as because that's the one up on the screen. So you can rate your desire to help others as very important if you have any of the following statements is generally true. You make personal sacrifices for others, you repeatedly volunteer time to community service organizations or with, whatever. But we can find parallels. These don't have to be specifically, just a community service organization. It could be your church or, something along those lines. You repeatedly find ways to help other people. You rate your desire as less important if either, or actually that should say if any of the following statements is generally true. You pay little attention to what is going on with others. You believe people should help themselves. You think that you should only help people who help you, and then only if they ask. And if you haven't decided that it's important or unimportant, then pick a middle score. And 3, 4, or 5 is, the 3 would be on the low end, a 4, 5, or 6 would be in the middle range. And again, don't get into splitting hairs. Don't try and figure it all out. It's not that critical. Okay? We're trying to get a global picture, not a specific answer. Any questions, comments, or concerns? You got that one? All right. Well, then it's time for us to look at the barriers. And I just want to share this with you before we go on with the specific examples of the barriers. It is important to remember that something prevents the avoidance of a motivator is also a barrier. So anything that stands in the way of escaping, okay, from something you don't want to be a part of is considered a barrier. Think of a house on fire, and you're trying to run to get out of the house, and the door is locked. That's a barrier, okay, because you're trying to avoid something. So that serves as a barrier too. Does that make sense? All right? So, as an example, if the individual assessed wants to avoid physical pain or seek comfort, and they have chronic pain disorder, this would be scored as a high barrier. Okay? Anybody know what type of folks typically who have intellectual disabilities typically have chronic pain disorders? Anybody know? PTSD? Big one. People have PTSD, very high frequency of chronic pain disorders. And folks who have fetal alcohol syndrome, because they have demyelination of the nerves. And so, because the myelin sheath didn't develop around their nerves the way it was supposed to because of the drug or alcohol intervention, effect at development. So they often have chronic pain. Now, they may have it very limited in terms of it may be just in their extremities. But you can also have all kinds of little paresthesias based on things like diabetes and other injuries. Yeah, go ahead.
So, very quickly, could you go over like something with food that could be something that people want or they don't?
Okay.
Or how would you go about rating that?
Okay, let's use food for just a moment. On the two ends of the food spectrum, we would have the anorexic who is refusing to eat, who says food is of no importance to me. Okay, so they'd score it as a 1. Okay. in importance, and you'd have the glutton on the other end. The guy who's always gotta have food. Pratt or Willie. Okay? On the other end of the spectrum. Does that make sense? So you can see how sometimes you can attach some of this dysfunction diagnostically to this, but I'm using that as because you said food. Now, so those are the extremes on food. Now what's your next question? What do
you do with the barriers?
The barriers? Okay. So if I'm always trying to make the woman who has anorexia eat, all right, then she's saying that's a barrier because I can't escape it.
So either way,
yeah, either way it could be a huge barrier. I've got the guy over here with Pratt or Willie, and I've got every freaking morsel of food locked up within a 40-mile radius, right? There's a big barrier to getting food. You know, I have to run away to go find food. Does that make sense now? Excellent question. Excellent question. Very helpful. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Well then, here is our current list of. I think it's Jen's turn to pass on now. So here's the list of barriers, and you can see that it's everything from peer pressure can be a barrier, a poor reputation, not having the skills that are necessary. Fear can be a barrier. Funding restrictions. Inability to have sufficient staff, not having transportation, everybody having to have a roommate, a workshop attendance that's mandatory. Any of those things can be a barrier if you're trying to escape. Does that make sense? Or you're trying to avoid something, or you're trying to get something. It's like I really want to work in the community, but they're saying I can't because if I work in the community, then there's no job coaches because they had to pull everybody back to the workshop because they had funding. Yeah, I mean, you can do that for forever, right? I mean, you know, the whys and wherefores. What matters is I'm trying to figure out how to work in the community, and you won't let me work in the community. That's a big barrier. The why isn't necessarily as important, and that's why you could have 5 or 6 or 7 things that are affecting those answers. Let me give you, for instance. I've got somebody who has a history of threatening children, okay, that we're working with. Now, let's say that it's, you know, somebody was concerned that, you know, a neighbor was concerned, and so there was this reputation, they got a criminal record thing going on, maybe a little bit, okay? So now, let's just go down the line of the things that, because I've got a guy who threatened a child 5 or 6 years ago, and maybe got a menacing charge against them, okay? So, could agency policy now affect that person being allowed to go out in the community on their own, having good social contact? Behavior problem potential, potential criminal history. Oh, the current residential service may not have sufficient staffing. Fear. Now, we don't have enough funding to be able to do that. Maybe the guardian's engaged in saying, he ain't going out by himself ever again. Do you understand? So, you can, the idea is not that you have to come up with a list of, you know, the all-inclusive list, and, well, I only found 3 barriers, so that must have scored as a 3. You're making it too complicated again. Okay? One barrier can be a 10. Okay? One barrier all by itself could be a 10. But especially if you start looking down there and you're seeing 4 or 5, 6 different things that are kind of popping off that list at you, or something else that triggers another thought that's related, there's a really good chance that person's maxing out there. You know, they're coming up with a 7 or an 8 or a 9 on the barrier scale. Does that make sense? Again, yes, it's relative, but it's supposed to be. It's relative to that person and to their situation. Okay? There's no way for us to have adjusted for every potential situation. That's why the barriers have to be unique to that person. So it's their perception of the barriers from their viewpoint, and it's your perception of the barriers from your viewpoint. And it's what are you trying to accomplish? How important is it that